All right, so good news. I'm still working on things, but giving myself a fuzzy deadline of this year meant that I was able to plan out most of my videos to be a little bit bigger, but this means that every video now suffers from a lot of scope creep, which means I don't think I can get every video out this year. So I ended up doing a lot more research, played a lot more games to get a lot more context on everything I've been wanting to do, but now I don't think I'll be able to finish any of the videos, except for the ones on 1920 plus. So that would be no orcs or fairy tale. So instead of delaying those videos to some unknown time in the future and kind of have them sitting there as weird obligations I don't exactly want, I'm going to cheat by doing two things. The first is I'm going to cancel the videos. I'm no longer obligating myself to make a video on either fairy tale or orcs. I still think they're cool ideas, but I no longer make plans to work on them in any capacity. And two, I'm releasing kind of the abstract of both of these videos in the follow-up sections to this little vlog here. This way I've technically filled my obligation to release videos on these subjects, so there you go. Let's get started. So the fairy tale issue was inspired less by the actual manga or show itself and much more by the weird presentation quality of the JRPG that released a few years ago. It was going to be a single video containing several essays, kind of like the one I did on genre, and I would have provided some context in the show and manga, which is mostly okay. I liked it, but it's not something I would recommend over most other shonen things like Mob Psycho or One Piece or Knights of the Zodiac. However, the meat of the thing would have focused on the game's radically shifting presentation quality and style. Fairy Tail has a lot of characters, which puts a strain on the budget in a way that anime and manga don't have to deal with, so the developers had to balance that as the best to their ability, which means you get a lot of weird stuff. Like, important characters are only represented by portraits or PNGs because they're used less often in combat scenarios. Cutscenes ranging from very cool CG animations to narrated PowerPoint slides. The game's all over the place and giving it a very budget vibe 1 minute and a full-blown AAA production the next. Thor High Heels in their Captain Tsubasa review calls this presentation Visual Novel Plus, and that feels like an appropriate description. Though playing SMT3 and Bravely Default 2 provided some good context on RPG story presentation and got me thinking of the scenes in a more theatrical rather than cinematic light. There's some other things I've kind of looked into about like the nature of Japanese puppet theater and some of these minor scenes where characters are just kind of talking and just sort of stuck in very particular poses while talking with certain facial expressions kind of tied into that as well. I was also inspired by Timur Hussein's video essay, Please Stop Turning Anime into Arena Fighters. The Fairy Tail JRPG uses turn-based combat that focuses a lot on enemy positioning to maximize damage in a turn, kind of like a very violent sliding block puzzle. Most shonen anime go the arena fighter route for the adaptation, and part of that is just kind of how perfect for the format is for shonen action scenes. At the same time, I feel like the JRPG format is kind of perfect in its own way. You don't get the same amount of energy, but you're better able to capture the structure of a shonen fight, particularly some of the fights in Fairy Tail. And I think it would be really neat to dive and compare the differences, as well as to look over to other games as potential inspirations for shonen adaptation, like Asura's Wrath, which has a lot of untapped potential, even though, QTEs are sort of viewed in a negative light when it comes to games. I think it could just mesh really well with a DBZ or a One Punch Man or a similar kind of game adaptation. So the next one is an orcs video, and this would have been at least 2 videos. The first is actually going to be pretty straightforward. It's a history of orcs, kind of, focusing mostly on appearance. Because orcs look kind of weird compared to other races popularized by Tolkien, like elves, dwarves, hobbits, all that other stuff. They just look like people, but they're either small or stocky, or they have funky ears and are really tall and pretty and stuff like that. They're just very, very, very human looking. And so how do we get them to be like a green version of Conan the Barbarian with weird sharp teeth going on for it, right? Like, how do we get from Tolkien's original version, which was basically just Mongolians with sharp teeth and bad skin, to green Conan, basically. I would have touched a lot about, Tolkien's representation and ideas and things like that, just kind of like on a very surface level way. Then I would have moved on to D&D, because there's an interesting aspect to it where, like, Gygax actually made them into pigmen, and that pigmen, or at least beastmen, and that beastmen aesthetic then, when D&D went to Japan, influenced things like Dragon Quest. This is why orcs are very pig-like. If you see it in a lot of different kinds of anime and video games, it's also why, to an extent, Ganon has a boar aesthetic. There's like an element of him being an orc in some of the early games to that extent. At the same time, things kind of kept going, and there's even an influence of Spider-Man on the orc aesthetic as well, and how certain arts and artists tried to adapt Tolkien and change the way the characters look. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in terms of the history and why orcs look the way they look and all this other stuff. The second video actually would have been a lot more serious, would have been a lot more in depth. The reason for it is because if you really, really want to dive into the production history of orcs, you're actually going to have to deal with a lot of heavy subject matter, including, in particular, racism and sexual assault. So the first video would have been something that, like, really light, really breezy, something that like a middle schooler can look at and maybe show their teacher or something, something that's appropriate to show off at schools if there happens to be like a Tolkien or a fantasy thing, not too heavy. And the other one would have been like, okay, let's get to the brass tacks of everything, right? Like Tolkien's representation of orcs is founded upon like some racist European ideas. He admits it as much as himself, right? He says, hey, Asian people are cool, but European people think Asian people are scary. So I'm going to appropriate that European imagery of, in particular, like Mongolian Golden Horde style invaders for my bad people. And then Gygax later on says, like, I need something to be like shock troops who work for an evil wizard, and so they do evil things, and rape is an evil thing, and so they're going to rape and pillage people, and that's how you get more orcs, through sexual assaults. Basically, Goblin Slayer, but it's codified in D&D. And there's kind of more to it, right? And how those things just kind of trickled out and influenced, future versions of D&D. Because these are decisions that happened really, really early in the kind of mythological history of the orcs, which causes ripple effects down the line. And it's not like, these happened in the past and have no impact now. Like Wizards of the Coast, Paizo, various other people who are interested in dealing with fantasy have to respond to those sorts of things. There was like during the pandemic, there was a big issue in which a member of their staff left and accused them of racism and not really holding up to their own ideals. And so Wizards of the Coast, in response, decided to say, hey, we're going to go ahead and rethink not only the way that we do work at our location, but also rethink the way that we present certain aspects of Dungeons and Dragons. Like the fact that orcs reproduced through sexual assault gets replicated later on in like Paizo and in Dungeons and in Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons, or the fact that half orcs like have an explicit paragraph of text talking about how orcs will capture regular human people, so that way they can breed half-orcs, so that way the half-orcs can lead the tribe because half-orcs are smarter than regular orcs. A lot of weird, unintentional eugenics sort of thing that I feel is more of a vestigial organ of the past rather than like an explicit like racial ideology that the developers of these games actually believe in. And so the only issue with that is that I'm not sure if it's going to be like more than 2 essays, is that there's so much on Tolkien alone, and then Dungeons and Dragons alone, and other forms of representation like Bright and Peter Jackson's versions of The Lord of the Rings, and other forms of like animated adaptations of The Hobbit. It creates a potential for those videos themselves to balloon even further, just so that way I can do these topics justice, right? And that's the main reason why I decided to like make a second video, is because one, I think the aesthetic history of the orc is interesting. It can be presented in a very sanitized way that's easy and cool for like children to pick up on and stuff, that can like plant the seeds of further investigation. But it is a dense and topic that touches on some pretty heavy things, and so I don't really want to gloss over the reality of the production history of the orcs. I feel that would be not irresponsible, but just like a missed opportunity. Like I could just do that work. There's no reason why I shouldn't, right? And then a big source of the inspiration for this topic isn't like, oh, this is like my own thoughts. Like there's an essay that was published in the Tolkien Encyclopedia called "Why is the Only Good Orc a Dead Orc?" And it touches upon a lot of the different ways in which orcs were presented, both in different versions of the Silmarillion, as well as questions that Tolkien wrestled with in some of his letters when talking to family members and publishers and editors about the nature of the orcs and how he wants them represented, and how like the origin of the orcs in his cosmology creates different kinds of theming and messages and all this other stuff. Right? There's just a lot to it. This isn't like a new thing. It's a historical thing. I think it would be a cool way to just kind of look at it and then take that essay, right, and apply it beyond Tolkien, so to speak. Also, like, not the only person who've done this. More recently, James Mendez Odes has put out a couple of articles, blog posts that kind of cover a little bit of the history. That doesn't go into the depth that I would have liked it to have gone in, but it does kind of provide a sort of insight in the direction I would have gone in. I agree with his conclusion. I think his scholarship can like do with a little bit more direct citation, but at the end of the day, I do ultimately agree that like Tolkien's representation of the orcs is grounded upon certain ideas of European martial military history, as well as Tolkien's own appropriation of European fears about Mongolian invasion that has its roots in the times or prior or after the Crusades. And so that's all really cool stuff. And again, I feel like it's important to talk about that if you wanted like a broad, thorough history, even if like I do have the goal of making kind of like a light overview, child-friendly history that doesn't really try to include things like, in particular, the sexual assault. Something that can be omitted, especially because the post D&D world starting around COVID like has started to address it. Like and I think that's something that's important. But that's it. I'm still working on 1920 plus. That's something that I'm going to keep under wraps for now. And that should definitely be able to come out at the end of the year. I'm really looking forward to those. It should be a lot of fun, art history and art adaptation stuff. But yeah, I feel that if I want to be able to balance this hobby with other things that I'm interested in doing and other things I'm interested in exploring, and work and everything like that, that I should probably just kind of cut down on ambitions, especially if I do not see an end for this sort of thing. And I don't want to cause some kind of burnout treadmill. So thanks for watching.